In the annals of military aviation, some aircraft are dismissed as failures, only to later prove their worth in unexpected ways. The P-63 Kingcobra was one such aircraft fighter that the United States deemed inadequate. Too flawed for the high-altitude dogfights of World War II, rejected by the very nation that built it. The Kingcobra found a second life when it was sent to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. What happened next was nothing short of shocking. The very flaws that led to its rejection in American service became its greatest strengths on the Eastern Front. At low altitudes, where Soviet pilots fought day in and day out, the Kingcobra excelled. Its powerful cannon, heavy armor, and unique design made it a terrifying weapon against German forces. Soviet pilots, once skeptical, soon discovered that this failed American fighter was the perfect tool for the brutal conditions of their war. The Kingcobra not only proved its worth in combat, but also became a crucial part of Soviet jet training, influencing an entire generation of pilots. This is the incredible story of how a rejected fighter became a game-changer in the skies of the Eastern Front, forever altering the course of history.
In the blink of an eye, the world was changed forever.
October 1943, Bell Aircraft's factory in Niagara Falls, New York, buzzed with activity as the first P-63 Kingcobras rolled off the assembly line. However, these planes weren't finished in the customary American colors. Instead, they sported Soviet red stars, marking their intended destination from the moment they left the paint shop. The United States Army Air Forces had just completed their evaluation of the Kingcobra and had rendered a harsh verdict. It was inferior to the P-51 Mustang. Not good enough for American pilots, and certainly not fit for deployment to Europe or the Pacific. However, America's Soviet allies were in dire need of fighter aircraft. And under the Lend-Lease program, those rejected Kingcobras wouldn't go to waste. In fact, 2,397 of them, 72% of the total production, were shipped to the USSR. American women pilots would fly them from the factory to Great Falls, Montana, before handing them off to Soviet ferry pilots, who would then fly them across the Bering Strait. When the first Kingcobras arrived in the Soviet Union in early 1944, veteran pilots took one look at the awkward design with its strange car door-style cockpit entry and scoffed. They saw it as just another reject, like its predecessor, the P-39 Kingcobra. The British had refused to fly the Kingcobra, and even the Americans had used it only reluctantly. Soviet test pilot Andrei Kochkov was assigned to evaluate this new gift from America. But his initial test flights nearly ended the program before it even began. To understand why the USAAF rejected the Kingcobra, it's essential to understand the requirements of American fighter doctrine in 1943. The U.S. was in the midst of a strategic bombing campaign over Europe, and long-range escort fighters capable of protecting B-17 and B-24 bombers at altitudes above 20,000 feet during deep missions over Germany were desperately needed. The P-51 Mustang, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and two-stage supercharger, excelled at these high-altitude escort missions. The P-63, despite being an improvement over its P-39 predecessor in nearly every way, still couldn't match the Mustang's high-altitude capabilities. Powered by an Allison V1710293 engine producing 1,325 horsepower, the Kingcobra was a strong performer at low altitudes. However, its single-stage supercharger meant that its performance dropped sharply above 15,000 feet. For escort missions over Germany, this proved to be a fatal flaw. But while the P-63 couldn't meet American needs, it found a place with the Soviets, who were already the largest users of the P-39 Kingcobra, having received nearly half of the 9,500 produced. Yet, the Kingcobra had earned a mixed reputation due to its tricky handling, dangerous spin behavior, and the MIDI-9 cockpit design, all of which made pilots uneasy. Unfortunately for the P-63, it inherited these same design quirks. The engine sat low in the fuselage, contributing to the awkwardness of the aircraft. Behind the pilot of the P-63 Kingcobra was a long drive shaft running beneath his feet, powering the propeller. This design added another layer of complexity, as the aircraft's center of gravity was extremely sensitive. The spin characteristics were unpredictable, and the plane's handling could turn dangerous without warning. Yet Bell Aircraft expected the Soviets to accept these American rejects. When Andrei Kochkov began testing the Kingcobra, the problems became clear almost immediately. During standard spin testing, the aircraft entered a flat spin, and the airframe began to buckle under the stress. The structural integrity was compromised in ways that could be disastrous in combat. Initially, Bell's engineers had dismissed Kochkov's concerns, assuming that as a Soviet test pilot evaluating a plane already deemed production-ready by American standards, opinions were secondary. What could he possibly know that the American engineers hadn't already discovered? However, after Kochkov demonstrated the flat spin recovery problem multiple times, showing that recovery was impossible without bailing out, Bell had no choice but to listen. The Soviets were about to become the largest buyers of the Kingcobra. And if their test pilots were pointing out fatal flaws, this would be a serious problem for Bell. In response to the feedback, modifications to the aircraft began. Soviet engineers suggested moving the aircraft's center of gravity forward to improve handling, and adjustments were made to facilitate spin recovery. The maximum aft center of gravity was modified. An additional armor protection for the pilot was added based on Soviet combat experience. Hardpoints were also added to the wings for bombs or additional fuel tanks, expanding the aircraft's versatility. Yet, despite these changes, Soviet pilots remained skeptical. The P-63, at its core, was still an American fighter designed for American doctrine, focused on high-altitude operations that supported strategic bombing. This was not well suited for the unique needs of the Soviet Eastern Front, where combat largely took place at lower altitudes. The Soviets saw little use for a fighter optimized for high-altitude operations. When the bulk of their battles were fought much closer to the ground, to add another layer of frustration, the agreement between the US and USSR stipulated that the Kingcobras were supposed to be reserved exclusively for operations against Japan in the Far East. According to the 1943 Lend-Lease terms, the Soviets were required to keep them east of the Ural Mountains, building up forces in preparation for a potential declaration of war against Japan. While thousands of Kingcobras were theoretically held in reserve for the Far East, the reality was far different. The war on the Eastern Front was in full swing, and Soviet pilots were fighting daily against the Luftwaffe. They desperately needed every capable fighter available. Unlike the high-altitude strategic bombing missions that the U.S. focused on over Germany, the Soviet air operations took place at much lower altitudes, most commonly between 6,000 and 10,000 feet, with some combat happening even closer to the ground, often at treetop level. These weren't long-range escort missions. They were short-range dogfights and ground attack missions, the lifeblood of Soviet air combat. The Kingcobra, designed for a very different combat environment, was not well suited for these conditions. These were short, intense, low-altitude battles, supporting ground forces in a rapid tempo, quick missions, high frequency. In multiple sorties per day from forward airfields near the front lines characterized Soviet air operations. At these altitudes, something unexpected began to happen with the P-63s, which were not supposed to be used in the West, despite official records indicating that only P-39s were involved in the fight against Germany. Reports started trickling back from both Soviet and German sources of Kingcobras appearing over the Eastern Front. German Stuka pilot Hans Rudd wrote in his memoirs about encountering American-made aircraft, particularly Arukabrus, Kingcobras, and Bostons over the Core land pocket. In early 1945, German flak units reported shooting down planes. That didn't match the profiles of the P-39s. Soviet pilots under the command of the legendary ace Alexander Pokrishkin later claimed that the entire 4th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment secretly converted 2 P-63s in 1944. Then, something remarkable occurred. Soviet pilots flying the P-63 in combat began to realize that America's rejected fighter was perfectly Suited to the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front, the Kingcobra's weaknesses at higher altitudes turned into its greatest strengths in low-altitude combat. The Allison engine, which struggled above 20,000 feet, performed spectacularly at 10,000 feet and below. The P-63 could hit speeds of 408 miles per hour at low altitudes. It's faster than almost anything the Luftwaffe could field in that environment. The heavy armor, which American pilots had criticized as a weight burden, became a lifesaver during ground attack missions. The Kingcobra's armored cockpit could withstand ground fire that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Soviet pilots accustomed to flying the fragile Polikarpov I-16 were astonished at how much punishment the P-63 could endure. Additionally, the P-63's 37mm M4 cannon, which American pilots had found awkward and difficult to aim during high-altitude combat, became incredibly effective in the low-altitude environment. It proved devastating against German ground targets, armored vehicles, and low-flying aircraft. A single well-placed 37mm round could cause catastrophic damage. The roll rate of the P-63 was exceptional, at 110 per second, better than the P-47, P-40, P-51, and even the Japanese Kawanishi N-1K2 in the fast-moving, twisting dogfights that defined Eastern Front combat. That roll rate could mean the difference between life and death. Soviet pilots discovered that they could dive the P-63 faster than any German aircraft. With the plane's structural speed limit approaching an incredible 5.62 mph, soon believable for 1944. If a German fighter managed to get on the tail, a Soviet pilot could simply dive and disappear. Knowing that the Luftwaffe pilot would not be able to follow without tearing off his wings, the sealed, heated cockpit was another revelation. Soviet pilots, used to freezing in open cockpits during the Russian winters, found the P-63's environmental controls luxurious by comparison. The aircraft's radios were far superior to those on Soviet-built planes, allowing for better coordination during operations. The tricycle landing gear made takeoffs and landings from rough forward airfields, much safer than the conventional taildraggers the Soviets were accustomed to. Unofficial combat reports that leaked out told a story of consistent success. Soviet pilots were racking up victories in the Kingcobra, an aircraft originally rejected by the Americans, but now proving to be a formidable force on the Eastern Front. Americans had deemed the P-63 inadequate. The Soviets adapted it to their needs with specialized group tactics that highlighted the Bellfighter's strengths. They utilized the Kingcobra in low-level intercepts against German ground attack aircraft, fast-slashing attacks on German armor columns, and escort missions for the IL-2 Sturmovik. The P-63's speed at low altitudes allowed it to stay with the slow-moving IL-2 South and still have the energy to engage enemy fighters. Pilots who had struggled with Soviet-built aircraft found the Kingcobra's handling characteristics more forgiving. Despite its quirks, yes, spins were a concern, and the fuel tanks in the wings could catch fire if hit. But overall, the aircraft was stable, predictable, and forgiving of mistakes, crucial qualities when flying multiple combat missions per day from primitive airfields. The 37mm cannon, though limited, proved ideal for the kinds of targets Soviet pilots engaged with regularly. German bombers, ground attack aircraft, and reconnaissance planes were no match for the Kingcobra's firepower. A single hit from the 37mm could sever a tail or take off a wing. In the waves of German Stukas and Henkels that still operated over the Eastern Front, the P-63 became a scythe, cutting through enemy aircraft with precision. Soviet aces quietly began transitioning to the Kingcobra. Pilots like Alexander Pokrishkin, who had made his name flying the P-39, saw the P-63 as an even better platform, more power, improved performance, and better survivability. By 1945, credible reports surfaced of P-63s in action at Kingsburg in Poland and during the final assault on Berlin. German after-action reports documented Kingcobras being shot down by both fighters and flak, and the evidence of widespread use on the Eastern Front became undeniable. Even as official Soviet records maintained the fiction that only P-39s were involved in fighting Germany. When the Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan on August 9, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, the P-63s, which had been reserved for this campaign, finally saw documented combat. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria, known as Operation August Storm, involved massive air operations across Japanese-held territories in Manchuria, Korea, and the Kuril Islands. The 17th Fighter Aviation Regiment of the 191st Fighter Aviation Division deployed P-63s for escort missions, close air support, and ground attack operations. On August 15, 1945, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Lieutenant Miro Nikchenko scored the first officially recognized air victory for the P-63, shooting down a Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa off the coast of North Korea. By this point, Japanese air resistance was minimal, with few fighters left to challenge Soviet air superiority. However, the P-63s proved their worth in ground attack roles. With their heavy firepower and armored protection ideal for strikes against Japanese positions, the 888th and 410th Fighter Regiments flew P-63s during the amphibious assault on the Kuril Islands, providing vital cover for the invasion fleet, a hodgepodge of converted torpedo boats and freighters that required all the air support they could get. Soviet Navy P-63s also operated over the Pacific, though they saw limited combat. The war ended too soon for the full potential of the P-63 Kingcobra to be realized against Japan as originally envisioned. But by then, it didn't matter. The Kingcobra had already proven its worth where it counted most on the Eastern Front, in the low-altitude environment where Soviet pilots actually fought. After the war ended, the truth about the P-63's combat performance began to emerge. By May 9, 1945, Soviet operational units still had 1,148 Kingcobras in service, a massive force that continued flying long after the Americans retired their last P-63s in 1,946. The Soviet Air Force kept the P-63 in frontline service until approximately 1950 before transitioning it to training duties. And here, another unexpected virtue of the Kingcobra emerged. It became the primary aircraft for training Soviet pilots to fly jets. The reason for this was simple. The P-63's tricycle landing gear matched the configuration of the new MiG-15 jet fighters that were entering service. While every Soviet-built piston fighter used conventional tailwheel landing gear, the P-63 shared the nose wheel configuration with the jets. This allowed pilots to master landing characteristics on the forgiving Kingcobra before transitioning to the far less forgiving MiG-15. This role extended the P-63's service life well into the early 1950s. Some units even kept one or two Kingcobras off the books as training aids, long after officially transitioning to jets. The similarity in landing characteristics made P-63 time invaluable preparation for jet operations. NATO eventually assigned the Kingcobra the reporting name Fred, acknowledging that enough of the aircraft remained operational to warrant tracking and identification. The French Air Force also received 114 P-63s after the war, deploying them during the First Indochina War. The French used them for ground attack missions in combat until 1951, when spare parts shortages forced their retirement in favor of the Grumman F-8F Bearcats. The P-63 Kingcobra story reveals a fundamental truth about military aviation. An aircraft's value is inherently tied to the doctrine it is designed for. American evaluators judged the Kingcobra through the lens of strategic bombing doctrine Halitude, long-range escort missions deep into enemy territory. By those standards, the P-51 Mustang was clearly superior and the P-63 was rightly rejected. But the Soviets were fighting a completely different war. Short-range, low-altitude missions supporting ground forces, high-tempo operations from forward airfields, and multiple sorties per day in brutal conditions. For that mission profile, the Kingcobra was nearly perfect. The aircraft that couldn't compete at 25,000 feet dominated at 10,000 feet. The heavy armor, which made it overweight for American operations, saved Soviet pilots' lives during ground attack runs. The 37mm cannon, which American pilots found awkward in high-altitude combat, proved devastating against low-altitude targets. Soviet engineers initially dismissed by Bell had voiced concerns about spin characteristics and other issues. Though their input had been ignored at first, it became critical to the P-63's development. The changes they demand in improved armor, additional hardpoints, positioned components transformed the aircraft into a platform that could excel in the harsh realities of the Eastern Front. The course of history, the modifications made to the center of gravity transformed the Kingcobra into an aircraft that was far better suited to the harsh realities of combat on the Eastern Front. American women ferry pilots flew thousands of Kingcobras from Buffalo to Alaska, many unaware of the success these once rejected aircraft would achieve in Soviet hands. Soviet women ferry pilots then flew them across Siberia to operational units. This often overlooked chapter in aviation history is a remarkable testament to the contributions of women pilots, whose efforts remained classified for decades. The P-63 Kingcobra never gained the fame of the P-51 Mustang or the Spitfire, nor did it earn the legendary status of the Corsair or the Thunderbolt. Yet its story carries profound implications for understanding military aviation history. Of the 3,303 Kingcobras produced, 2,397 to 72.6% of the total production were sent to the Soviet Union. This represents one of the highest percentages of any American aircraft type provided to an ally during the war. For every Kingcobra that flew in American colors, 3 flew with Soviet red stars. The success of the Kingcobra in Soviet service validated design choices that American doctrine could not accommodate. The mid-engine configuration, which had seemed awkward to American engineers, became more acceptable once its benefits were understood. It provided better weight distribution and enhanced ground attack capability, as well as the devastating nose-mounted cannon. The P-63's role in Soviet jet training programs extended its influence well beyond the war. Thousands of Soviet pilots got their first experience with tricycle landing gear on Kingcobras before transitioning to MiG-15s and MiG-17s. The lessons learned from flying Bell's rejected fighters shaped the generation of Soviet jet pilots during the early Cold War. American pilots who encountered Soviet aircraft during the Korean War may have faced pilots whose most recent piston-engine experience had been in P-63s, an aircraft that America had declared inadequate, yet which had trained the opposition. This story proves that rejected doesn't mean worthless. Context matters. Mission profiles matter. The same aircraft that failed in one operational environment can excel in another. The low-altitude fighter that couldn't escort bombers over Berlin could dominate ground attack missions over Ukraine. This is how America's rejected fighter changed everything. Not by transforming American air power, but by proving that aircraft design must align with operational realities. Allies fighting different wars need different tools. Sometimes the exports we barely notice become legendary in someone else's hands. By the time the last Soviet P-63s were retired in the early 1950s, they had served longer, flown more combat missions, and influenced more pilots than anyone at Bell Aircraft could have imagined when they first watched those Kingcobras roll off the production line, adorned with Soviet red stars. The Americans saw a failed fighter. The Soviets saw exactly what they needed, and that difference in perspective would change everything.